Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker and I'm here with Jeffrey Poole and Joe Lalo. And we've got another return guest for you this week, Chris Fox. You may have caught him on some of the other podcasts. He's been making the rounds. And we're going to talk about his new book, Writing to Market, kind of how to sell more by doing less, I would almost say, like, really tailoring your book to hit the tropes and fit the genre and therefore hopefully catch on and stick on Amazon better. And he's also just finished a 21-day novel challenge in which he wrote his book and also edited it. So we're going to ask him about that at the end too. But for those who don't remember, he's the author of the Deathless series, Project Solaris, and the new nonfiction Write Smarter, Write Faster series. When we had him back on before on show 38, he was talking about writing 5,000 words an hour. At the time, he was still working as an app developer in San Francisco, but he's now gone full-time. So, hey, Chris, welcome to the show, and I'll let you talk for a minute.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, man. That's a long intro. I guess I've done a lot in the last year. It's surreal to see how my career has transformed in the last 12 months, based largely on the information available on podcasts like this. So it's funny, you put this stuff into effect, you try a few new tactics, and all of a sudden you can go from 4 figures a month to 5 figures a month without blinking.
Yeah, I've definitely been impressed in the past when sometimes you just keep putting books out and you don't necessarily see the results, but then one little thing once you have a catalog out there can really affect your income and in a good way if you get like a good BookBub promo or something like that. But yeah, why don't you catch us up with what you've been doing kind of in the last 6 months or so, your new books and what you're trying now.
Sure. So for anybody who saw the last interview, I wrote fast because I didn't have a choice. My writing time was confined to my commute into San Francisco, where I worked at a startup. So on the bus is where I was writing those words. And I got to a point where I made enough money that I said, okay, I can give up the software job, and did so. And I realized all of a sudden I've got so much more time on my hands. How do I want to approach this new lifestyle of I'm a full-time author? And I looked around it and thought, what am I capable of doing? So I decided I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to do it in 3 weeks' time. That's both writing and editing it, and see if that's possible and sustainable. I'd heard of people like Amanda Lee. I knew she could do it. So I crossed my fingers. I kind of dove in and opened up my process, recorded a bunch of videos about it, and finished that book. And that was kind of a seminal moment. I've learned that churning out a book a month is something that I can do. That book does not have to suck. It can be good, and I could just keep cranking them out. I've put out a book a month since October, so what are we in March now? So 6 books in the last 6 months. It's been a whirlwind, and it's been extremely lucrative.
Awesome. And speaking as someone who's done that a couple times, I will agree that it's possible. Although if you're writing the epic fantasy and they're like 150,000 words, you're setting yourself up for more of a challenge there. I think I've usually done it with like 75,000 word novels or so.
Yeah, that's definitely more achievable. I think you get into the 120 plus, and it just structurally it's a lot harder to keep everything straight, and it takes longer.
Yeah, I've definitely found that the simpler stories too, with like one or two point of view characters, at least for me, are a lot easier when I start to get up into like four point of view characters, and they always go over 100,000 words or 200,000 words.
I've been there.
So gotta love fantasy.
Mhm.
All right. From listening to your other interviews, I know you were kind of inspired to get into analyzing the market and figuring out how to succeed because you kind of, I guess your Heroes Born book kind of didn't meet your expectations. Could you talk a little bit about that and what happened?
Yeah, I put out a book in December called Hero Born. It was the first book in the Project Solaris trilogy. It was a spin-off from my main series. And the people who like my main series love it. So I think the book is pretty well written, but the mistake that I made is I thought there was going to be this huge network of rabid fans ready to snatch it up because I was combining X-Files with Heroes. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. That's mixing peanut butter and pickles together. It didn't sit well with people who were reading it. They weren't sure if it was a book about aliens or if it was a book about superheroes. And so I think there was too much confusion there, and it kind of launched with a whimper, which was a big wake-up call for me.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed with my pen name, I do the science fiction romance, and you would think, oh, everybody that loves sci-fi and everybody that loves romance should be a fan, but in reality, it's people that have to love sci-fi and have to love romance, and it ends up being kind of a small Venn diagram or whatever it is there. So it's actually the cross-genre stuff I think is a harder sell in general.
Yeah, it's generally more fun to write, I think, for most of it. But to get to a point where we can do that stuff, I'm learning that it'd be smarter for me to put out something a little bit more mainstream first. Still something I really enjoy writing. I mean, now I write about giant spaceships, but something that I think there's more of a ready market for that has been proven because there are a lot of books that are filling that need currently.
Okay, and I don't think we've touched on it yet. What exactly are you going to do for your project that you're trying to write to market?
So this book was conceived and plotted in about a week and written in 3 weeks. So the goal is I'm going to send that out to a proofreader. She's going to go ahead and make her changes, and I'll integrate those. And then without going to beta readers or without going to a developmental editor, I'm taking this book that was written in 21 days and I'm putting it up on Amazon. And I'm going to document every part of the launch, just like I did with the writing and editing of this book, to show that if you hit the right notes, if you've got the right tropes in your book, and if you do the right types of marketing, then people will buy your book. And I've got my fingers crossed. I think I can make it into the Amazon top 1,000 with this pretty easily, and that it'll stay sticky there for at least a month.
Yes, we all want that. So I'm going to be watching too, because as I was telling Chris before the show, I'm on the second book now I'm doing 3 books in a sci-fi series I'm going to launch later this year. And so when I saw he's doing military sci-fi, I'm just doing kind of a science fiction adventure in space. But as I was reading your book, though, I was like, oh yeah, mine's probably not going to stick and be a winner because I'm not doing all the same tropes you were talking about. But I'm going to ask you a little more about that later because I want to do some advanced questions, but let me hand you to the guys. I think they're going to do some kind of more introductory questions.
Yep. And since the topic is writing to market, let's start by defining how would you define writing to market?
Writing to market, as I define it, is finding an intersection between something you would love to write and something that has a voracious appetite. So a genre that you know plenty of people are picking up books for.
And how would you differentiate that from, like, some people would call that like chasing trends, basically. What's the difference between the two?
That chasing trends sounds derogatory, but whichever way that you slice it, if you want to pay your rent, if you want to get books out there that people are going to read, if you want to get a larger email list so you can write whatever you want to, you've got to put a book out that is somewhat familiar to other books that these people have read. If they're reading books about giant spaceships, you want to put out a book about giant spaceships too. It can be original. It still needs to be excellent. Your craft has to be great. You need a wonderful, tightly paced story and great characters. But you're doing it adhering to certain tropes that are going to fit whatever genre you've chosen so that the people that have already read books for that are not going to balk when they see yours. They're not going to say, okay, not really into robot uprisings very much, so I'm not going to pick that up. You're going to write something you know that top-selling books have already done and done well.
Right. Okay. So, and I guess something like that would differentiate it from, again, trend tracing is that trends tend to be quick in, quick out. Like they don't last long. And this is sort of, you'd be choosing something that's a bit more proven.
You can, depending on the genre that you're in. So a lot of my friends that do romance or erotica, especially, the trends are changing constantly, and they are kind of always chasing a market, but they're also making a great six-figure living doing it. So you have to ask yourself why you're doing this writing. You should still be able to make art and write books that you absolutely love, but when chasing trends, if you want to use that term, you sort of conform to the tropes that exist there, and you know you're gonna get enough sales to continue to pay your rent.
That's sound thinking. When you're sculpting a book to suit a particular market, do you think there's a sweet spot for the length, or does that change with the market that you're shooting for?
Changes very much with the market. So if you're writing epic fantasy, for example, your book has to be at least 100,000 words, and people will probably still complain at that length. If you're writing romantic comedy or a cozy mystery, you can get away with 60,000 words. Same with a thriller. So it's key to know what your genre will support, but it varies from genre to genre.
So it also sounds like if you're shooting for like rapid releases, then there are certain genres that really aren't well suited to this, like epic fantasy with the expectation of over 100,000 words. You wouldn't want to focus on that if your goal is to put out books once a month.
Right, you're going to have a much harder time with that. Although I do see people who take a fast publishing approach to epic fantasy. So Sever Brony is a great example. Writes middle grade epic fantasy. He's put out 4 books in the last year. The last one was like 220,000 words long. So he does write long, but people love his work. So if epic fantasy is the niche you want to carve out, you won't get out your 12 books a year, but you'll still put out 4 or 5, and that's going to be enough to pay the bills if you're hitting the right notes.
It's hilarious to me how often the difference between success and failure is, oh, all you have to do is write very quickly and extremely well. Like, well, that's certainly good information, but not great advice because you can't exactly follow it without a lot of practice.
It's simple, but it's not easy. So sure, if your craft is mediocre, you're not going to be able to turn those books out. But the way that you get from being crappy at this to being amazing at this is cranking out as many words as possible. So if you write 4 more bad books in the next 6 months, when you write book number 5, you're going to have learned lessons all the way through those 4 bad books.
It's interesting how universal that advice is. I was listening to a podcast recently where an actor was talking about turning down movies that he thought would do poorly, and he was talking to a veteran actor who said, "I wish I would have done more crap early on because it's great practice."
Hmm.
All right, so is this strategy one that you would recommend for a first-time writer, or would it be better to experiment a bit with writing and see what you can do before you try to narrow in on a target?
I think that going into it eyes open is important, even at the beginning. So when I first churned out a novel that I thought was finally worthy of being read, it took me a good 2 years, and that's true for most new authors. And by that point, whatever change or whatever trend that you were researching has probably changed significantly. But if you go into it knowing that an audience exists right now, you at least stand a better chance of putting out something that they'll enjoy reading, even if it takes you a while.
Now, with this technique, obviously you've not been at this particular technique for a while, so this is a question we'd have to ask you upon a third appearance in the future. But if you're saying fairly recent with your trends, and trends come and go fairly quickly, uh, won't your back catalog start to, I don't know, go stale a bit faster, like as the trend passes, or do you think that you'll still have a strong long tail on things?
I think you'll still have a strong long tail if you are writing good books. If you focus first and foremost on good craft and good story, look at like the Dresden Files, for example. I mean, that's been going for 15 years. Trends have come and gone, but because we love those characters, we're going to keep buying his books as they come out. And you can kind of achieve the same sort of loyalty if you're doing this the right way and really taking your craft seriously.
And do you think that like when a trend goes, you should what can I say? Do you adapt a long-running series to follow trends, or do you end a series and start a fresh one when it starts to diverge too much from what's popular?
It's going to depend on your goals. I think one of the big advantages is if you've got a long series, by the point that the trend is diverged, you also have enough loyal fans that you can probably keep putting books out in that series and still selling really well.
Yeah, all right. And I guess the last question for me for this section would be, how far from your native genre do you think you can diverge and still write a compelling book? And moreover, how do you differentiate a book that failed due to poor market targeting versus one that was just written poorly?
2 questions. So the first one, I guess we'll start with quality first. So the second question first. In order to figure out whether or not your book failed due to quality, a lot of it is going to be overall sales. How much was it selling versus what are the reviews like? So if you have incredible marketing and a great cover and a compelling blurb and you've worked really hard to get all that ready and you're selling books like hotcakes, but your average reviews are rolling in, 1, 2, and 3 star, and people are complaining about editing or just saying that this bored me, didn't interest me, that's going to be your huge red flag that you need to go back to the drawing board and maybe get a writing coach or a developmental editor to help you.
Yeah, it's funny. Like we'll often talk about don't read your bad reviews, like don't dwell on your bad reviews. But it's very important to read your bad reviews when that's all you're getting.
Definitely. That's the way you're going to learn. I think the big problem I had early on was I took everything personally. So you'd get that 1 star review, especially when you only have one book out. It's just horrifying. You're like, oh God, I worked so hard on this and this person hates it. And it's the worst when the person hates it for a legitimate reason and you know it. But if you approach this like you're in school, so you're in 7th grade right now, working your way up towards high school on the writing path, It just means you have more to learn. You know, you get a bad grade on a test. Keep moving, learn from the experience, and get better. And try not to take it personally when you run across those one-star horrendous reviews.
Yeah, very much so. And I guess back to that the first half of the question, how far from your native genre do you think you can diverge and still write a compelling book?
Not very. So this, I think, is where the difference between chasing trends and writing to market lies in my definition. You need to love what you're writing. If you don't love what you're writing, your readers are going to sense it. You're going to phone it in, and you're competing against people who do love what they're writing. So it's okay to have a bunch of genres that you like to write. I like, thrillers. I like horror. I like sci-fi and fantasy. I like nonfiction. So you can have an array, but you kind of have to stick.
All right. Well, that's it for me. So I'm going to pass you off to Jeff now to continue the questions.
Alrighty, and everybody gets those 1-star reviews. It's the last thing you want to do is ever just respond back to that reviewer. That's always a negative. But okay, so continuing on Joe's first half of that last question there about how far off your native genre one can diverge. I'm kind of curious, since I have a vested interest in this. Have you come across any combinations of different genres that are generally aren't accepted by the readers? Like, for instance, if you're typically a romance author and you want to try using your techniques and try your hand at a horror novel. I mean, would you recommend doing something like that?
Probably not two discordant genres like that because they're not going to play nicely together. And how you figure out the answer when you compare two genres is what are the readers getting out of a given genre? So why does a romance reader read a book and why does a horror reader read a book, and are those the same reason? If the answer is yes, then you can probably safely combine those two genres. You'll have that overlap. Like mixing sci-fi and fantasy or mixing thriller into one of those genres will work. But horror and romance are radically different, and reader expectations are radically different, so you're not going to be able to satisfy both crowds by blending those genres.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, in my case, I'm getting ready to release my first mystery novel. I'm typically epic fantasy. I'm not used to writing in the style. It's shorter because I'm used to 100,000 plus.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw my wife is like, "Have you looked at the length of these mystery novels that you want to write?" I'm like, "No, I'm just assuming same length." She's like, "No, no, no, you need to look." And I had some on my shelf over there, and they're on average 55 to 60,000 words for this type of mystery. I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to start doing some serious editing here and drop some of this stuff out because apparently I'm long-winded, but whatever works there. Okay, let's see here. My question for you is: your writing to market book designed to take completed manuscripts and prepare them for publishing, or do you think you want to read your book first and then okay, then plan out my book and then and go for it? I mean, can you do any sort of I can say, okay, you know what, looks like he suggested this and I'm guilty of that, and are they quick fixes, or is this something that they need to do from scratch?
Ideally, you're doing it from scratch, but if you pick the book up and you've already got a novel out there that you're trying to kind of get traction with, you can take some lessons away. So if you look at the way that you're presenting your book, what your blurb says, what categories it's in, all that stuff is covered in Right to Market, and you can modify everything from keywords to cover to blurb. So it's never too late to rescue a novel that you feel has failed or is doing poorly. So there is some takeaways there. The sequel, which will be out next month, is called Launch to Market. I think that'll be more universally useful, though, for most people who are trying to launch a book or relaunch a book.
Okay, and okay, so with regards to some of these strategies, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen other authors make that can be easily rectified,
Um,
or are there
not
any?
having enough specific keywords is a big problem. So trying to get a balance between search terms on Amazon and being in the right categories, not just as many categories as possible, but the right categories where you can make it into the top 20 so people will see your book, you'll have that organic discovery, categories where readers who click on your cover are going to be excited by what they find inside and not a book that doesn't belong there. So for example, one of the things that we all see on Amazon, there are a number of erotica books that are miscategorized. So you'll go to, vampires, for example, and you may have stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with vampires, doesn't belong in a horror subgenre at all, but it's there because the author in question thought, hey, I'm going to get it as wide in exposure as I can because I'll sell more books that way.
Alrighty, and And then, since we were just talking about this, do you have, or do you know of any examples of books that you feel have been perfectly written for using your techniques? So that way, if someone wants to say, well, let's just see an example of someone that uses correct keywords and tries to target specific genres and niche theirs, do you have any examples that somebody can look up?
I would start with Domino Finn. So Domino Finn is mentioned in the book. He's somebody that I know from Kboards and other online sources. He killed it with Dead Man, the first book in his new urban fantasy series. He nailed the tropes perfectly. The book is selling like hotcakes. The sequel just came out and it's doing great as well. So Domino's a great example of, if you want to get multiple books in a series under that 10,000 rank and make a living doing this is kind of what you need to do.
Domino Finn. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay, make sure you add that to the to the show notes there, because I think that'd be a good one for people to look up. But in that respect, let me pass you over to Lindsay, and she's got some questions for you.
Well, people have to buy the book because it's all meant. He gives a bunch of examples in the book, but okay, Chris, I don't think we've actually kind of gone right out and said, how are you finding the categories on Amazon that would work for your right to market strategy?
So I started by making a list of categories that I would want to write in. Like, what am I interested in? And the answers that I came up with were kind of a Star Wars-like space opera, a military science fiction book, sort of like Mass Effect, Battlestar Galactica, or StarCraft. I came up with a couple of different genres of horror that I thought would be fun to tackle, like Lovecraftian horror books would be a lot of fun. And I went down this list, and I ended up with like 8 or 9 different categories, all the way down to like archaeological thrillers. And then I looked at each one of these categories to see how competitive that genre was going to be. I would look at the top 100 books and just sort of look for the tail of the rankings. So ideally what you're looking for is the top 20 books are selling really, really well, but by the time you get down to book like number 60 or 80, they're not selling at all well. And so I just went through and I did that for every one of these categories until I found a category I thought that could sell really well, but that I was also really excited about writing.
And your reasoning is kind of like there's enough demand that these top 10 or whatever are selling really well, but the fact that there's not a whole lot in the top 100 is that saying like there's just not enough good books in this category?
Exactly, and we as readers, since we all love science fiction and fantasy, are continuously in that boat where you'll finish a lot of the best books in a genre, and you'll look around and say, okay, now what can I read? So when you find a genre where the answer is, well, there's nothing, then that one's ripe for, I don't want to use the word exploitation, but ripe for you to contribute to and get a book that readers are going to love.
Right, and something I've kind of talked about before that I think may be true, and I'd love to have your opinion on it, is that should it be a category too that is kind of underserved by the traditional publishers? It seems like, the space opera, military, sci-fi, I can only think of like a handful of people that publish, and their books come out like every 3 years from Big Five. So to me, I can understand why I look now and there's all these indie authors doing really well in that category. What are your thoughts on that?
I would think that if there was a category that was mostly overrun by the Big Five, that would be really, really ripe for an indie series, because we can price much less expensively than they can. We can produce content way faster than they can. So in the same time it takes them to put out, book 2 of a series that's been out for a year and a half, you can put out books, 3, 4, and 5, and readers are going to flock to that.
True. I have seen, though, I think it's harder to take off, like in, say, epic fantasy, which is really quite a few traditionally published authors already in that genre. And even though we can lower price, I feel like a lot of times people turn to the indie stuff when they're not getting enough from the authors they really like. I think mystery thriller is one that traditionally indies haven't, there's some indies doing well, but we haven't seen a lot of people killing it. But there's so many mystery thriller authors out there already that's like, do people need to turn to indie fiction? Or, some people enjoy picking up indie stuff just for the heck of it. But I still feel like, all things being equal, they want, maybe traditional published, a name brand in the genre. I don't know.
I think that's true for epic fantasy. The problem with epic fantasy as aspiring and unknown authors is you're asking people to take on a lot if they're going to pick up your series. You think about how much time you spent reading The Name of the Wind or The Wheel of Time or Sanderson's books. It's an investment, and so before people are willing to make that investment, they're going to want usually multiple recommendations, and that's different than how they'll approach a book that is only 50 to 60,000 words long that they're expecting to kill in an afternoon. There's just so much more reader investment, I think, in epic fantasy, and maybe that's why it's so hard to gain traction there.
Yeah, I definitely found it easier in steampunk where there's only maybe like 2 or 3 big name authors that are publishing regularly in the category. So I feel like people have to check out the indie stuff if they want some more airship fiction to read. All right, I know you're reading the top, you were kind of checking out, once you picked your category, you read sort of the top selling books in the genre. Could you talk about how you actually kind of looked at the commonalities in them to see what's selling well and what people want?
Yeah, so I'll use the same example that I did in the book, and that's military science fiction because that's what I wanted to write. I love Battlestar Galactica. I think that most hardcore sci-fi fans do, and there's a whole breed of book that uses that as kind of the backbone. So think there's a long vanished enemy, or there is an enemy that's new and is just showing up for the first time. Mankind is outclassed, and you've got sort of the dregs of the fleet, usually one lone starship, trying to hold them back against all odds. And that kind of underdog mentality is the chief trope that people seem to be liking in military science fiction right now. So if you've got an idea where you think you can come up with a ragtag crew, a great captain, and a compelling enemy, that's enough to start building your book around.
All right, I'll do that for the next series. Instead, I have more of a Firefly model, which is probably not a good idea since it was canceled in the first season. I don't know. We'll find out.
I think Firefly was my second to top choice, so I went with military science fiction, but there is a thriving market for people who like Firefly-like fiction, and I think that it can take off if it's well written and branded well. You've already got a following, so I suspect that yours will sell well. I mean, I'll buy it when it comes out.
All right, thanks. We'll see. I am going to try Kindle Unlimited. Are you going to do that with your series? I never have before with my regular name stuff, but I figure this is the time if I'm doing a new genre, nobody's going to be disappointed that they can't read the next book in the series. Is your plan kind of depending on Kindle Unlimited, or are you going wide?
Yeah, very much so. I think that Kindle Unlimited is a must if you want to take off in a new genre, just by virtue of the way that Amazon algorithms work. So, being a software engineer, I guess on the side now, since that's no longer my primary income, I've studied Amazon closely, and if I understand the way the algorithms work, they're looking for a certain baseline of sales. And when they figure out where that baseline of sales is for a book, they start showing the book to people and measuring how many people buy it. So if they think that some people are going to buy it, they may show it to 10 people. And if 4 of those people buy it, they'll show it to 10 more. If none of those people buy it, then they won't show it to anybody else. So you want to have as many people as possible either download or purchase your book when it's being shown to them. And being in Kindle Unlimited gives you a whole other avenue where you can sell books that way. So it's usually going to push you up much higher in the rankings.
All right, yeah, that's what I've seen kind of in the last year or two, is that a lot of the people who do break out with just the first book in a series without anything else going on, they seem to be in Kindle Unlimited. Not, there have been some exceptions, but it just seems like it's such an advantage right now on Amazon with the borrows counting towards the sales ranking.
Yeah, and I do see a lot of people, and I've done this myself, who you'll start launching books into Kindle Unlimited, but then after a term of 3 months, or maybe 2 terms, so up to 6 months, you'll pull it out and go wide.
Yeah, that's what I thought I would do if my fans don't lynch me and before then. Like, I gotta do at least 3 months, guys. All right. So you're it sounds like in your book, like you feel like you're going to know pretty much right away as soon as you release this if everything went to plan and if it worked. Whereas, a lot of the advice out there is like, you got to plan to do a series. If you can, maybe launch 3 or 5 books, one after the other. Do you any thoughts on like how you'll know after just one book, or are you going to end the series if it doesn't take off after the first book?
I'm definitely writing all 3 books, so the trilogy will get finished no matter what, just because I can do them so quickly, and I've already commissioned the covers. As far as knowing how well the series is doing, you can tell really quick, and a lot of people don't like accepting this because if you've put out a series and it doesn't do well, we all have that sunk cost syndrome of maybe there's something I can do to tweak it. But here's the simple fact. If you launch a book onto Amazon and you get some initial buzz and you get some initial sales from your mailing list or however else you do that, that's going to be enough to interest Amazon's algorithm. And if your book is the right type of book, it's going to take off and sustain itself on its own. So kind of the magic of writing to market is if it works, you don't have to do a bunch of continuous promotion to force it to stay up there. Amazon's going to keep showing it to people, and it'll sell on its own.
All right. I've had that happen to some degree. I've stayed in like the top 1,000 or 2,000 with some of the steampunk stuff, but I'm still hoping one day for that one that sticks up there in like the top 500 or better. That'd be That would be cool. You don't see that too much in steampunk unless you're Jim Butcher.
And even that one wasn't as sticky as I thought it would be.
It stayed at the top of the category for a while, but I will be the first to admit it doesn't take a lot to be at the top of the steampunk category. All right, I got kind of a long question here for you. I don't know if you caught Ed Robertson on the Self-Publishing podcast probably a few months ago was talking about how if you're jumping genres, which you're doing and I'm doing, and you've got fans already that read, say, fantasy, epic fantasy, or urban fantasy, and then you're kind of launching into the science fiction genre. He was kind of talking about how if you promote it to your list, you might end up screwing up your also bots because these people buy fantasy for the most part. So here's your military sci-fi sticking in, a bunch of urban fantasy also bots. Do you agree with that? And if so, are you going to combat that by not launching it to your list right away, or what are your thoughts there?
He's absolutely 100% right. You're going to shift your also bots radically based on how many people of what type are buying it. So if there are a bunch of fantasy readers, you'll end up with fantasy also bots. The way to combat that is to find where your desired audience is. So in the case of science fiction, maybe you go over to some of the subreddits over on Reddit that are devoted to science fiction and post to try and get people interested. And then you segment your mailing list. So if you've got, say, 700 people, because it's a nice round number for the math here, you only tell 100 of them a day for the entire week about the book, so that you're getting more of a trickle of people coming in each day, and it's going to do less damage to your also bots. If you supplement that with things like, Facebook ads aimed at sci-fi fans, then in theory you should be able to make sure that you keep kind of the also bots that you're after.
All right, yeah, that's what I was thinking, is maybe trying the Facebook ads. I've not had a lot of luck with them in the past, at least as far as breaking even goes, but maybe throw some money at that book one, especially in my case. I'm planning to do a whole series, so there'll be more books to get them into. So I think a lot of people, there's kind of a misconception out there that you have to write like romance or erotica in order to do well, even if you're doing this writing to market kind of thing. And I know you did several examples in your book, and I of course know from personal experience that that's not true, but do you have any thoughts on that? Do you know of people that are doing really well just even in smaller markets?
Extremely. Probably my favorite success story right now is Todd Hodges has a book called The Never Hero. And so it's, kind of a little bit of time travel, a little bit of superhero mixed in, and this book is selling like you wouldn't believe. So it's the only book that Todd has put out, and he's had $20,000 months off this one book. And it took off sometime around early last summer and has been selling ever since. So I know quite a few people like Todd who, if you hit the right notes in the right genre, there's a killing to be made, and it doesn't have to be, romance or erotica to make a living doing this.
Cool. And do you have any thoughts within the science fiction fantasy kind of umbrella, from your own research, like which might be good ones to go after besides like the military sci-fi, and we talked about steampunk a bit.
Urban fantasy is still huge. So it's high competition because it's a very saturated genre, but if you can make a great character and come up with a good compelling story that hits the right notes, Domino Fin is proof that still works and works well. So I think urban fantasy is hot. I suspect space opera is going to get a lot hotter now that Star Wars is out. So I'm seeing some rumblings of that, but it hasn't happened entirely yet. So that's another good area for you to investigate. Superheroes are extremely popular right now. So any sort of superhero fiction, as long as you're adhering to the right tropes, should do pretty well.
All right, Joe is getting excited because he's got a superhero novel that I think he wished had done a little better. But maybe he's going to bring it back to life.
Maybe.
All right, just the last couple of questions on this topic. I don't think we asked, what are you planning to do for pricing as far as your launch goes?
So initially I was going to put it 99 cents for the first 3 weeks, but after talking to some of the top-selling authors in sci-fi, they said that price tolerance is a little better in that genre. So what they recommended is that I do 99 cents for a week, and I think I am going to do that, and then I'll raise it back up to $2.99 for the first book. And I'll probably leave it there for the foreseeable future once that sale ends initially.
Sounds good. And yeah, it does seem like if you're in Kindle Unlimited, you can price more because half your readers anyway are just going to be borrowing it, so it might not matter in the long run.
Yeah, you want that initial boost, I think, of when you tell your mailing lists, or in my case, several mailing lists, about the book, you want to let them know that it's on sale because that's going to get that whole scarcity thing going, and people are far more likely to buy a book on sale for 99 cents than picking it up at $2.99.
Definitely. And I just wanted to ask, you mentioned keywords earlier. Are you doing anything besides, using some in order to get in, can't select from the dashboard? Are you actually doing like fill in the suggestion and picking some that seem to, more on the search engine than the categories?
I am. I'll be doing both. One of the things I think that a lot of people will find interesting is I'm recording all this stuff. So as I do the launch and I do things like keywords, I'm just going to turn on the screen record and I'll go through the keywords on the screen, show you exactly what I'm using for the keywords, and then release that video. So you'll be able to see on my YouTube channel what I'm doing for keywords, what I'm doing for blurb, why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, and hopefully people will be able to replicate that in their own genres.
Awesome. Yeah, for anybody listening here, I think Chris, is it chrisfoxwrites.com? You've been posting all your YouTube videos along the way?
Uh-huh. And at the top there's a tab that says 21-Day Novel Challenge. They can sign up to get the access to the videos there, or just go straight to YouTube and look for Chris Fox Writes.
All right, cool. Well, let's jump into the 21-day challenge bit here at the end and see if we can get some questions and any tips for people who also want to be able to write a novel and edit it in 3 weeks.
All right, this was definitely the most fun I've had doing anything writing related in quite some time. So, as people know, I wrote 5,000 words per hour. I followed it up with Lifelong Writing Habit, and now I've put out Write to Market. And the 21-Day Novel Challenge was kind of layering all three of those methodologies together and proving to people who don't think it's possible to write fast and write well that I could do it. So in 21 days, I've written a novel that I've now read that I think is pretty good. I think it can hang with the current crop of science fiction out there. And it only took me the 3 weeks to write and polish. So in that first 2 weeks, I did a rough draft, and I recorded it all. I put up the video showing what I was doing. And in the last week, I edited it. And I just did what I call one-pass editing, where I have a kind of a complex system, but I spelled it all out in the videos. And I walk through all the changes that I made. I sent the Scrivener file and the rough draft of the book to the mailing list so they could look and see all the things I was doing in the file and how it was changing as we went through the challenge.
Nice. Okay, well, let me hand you over to Joe and let the guys talk a little bit more.
Yep. Now you're describing the 21-day novel challenge. Let me ask you, what was your target word count on this book?
My target word count was 70,000.
How close did you get?
I ended up at 64,000 words.
That's pretty good. I recently tweeted I had a target of I think it was 75,000 for a novel I'm writing now, and I'm at 82 because I can't write short. All right, so you say that this was developed off of basically the other techniques that you've been working on. Like, obviously, people are familiar with NaNoWriMo, where you're writing a 50,000 word novel in a month. Did that weigh into this at all, or was this just beside the point that it's a similar challenge?
I think it did. Most writers, myself included, started with Nano. So getting 50,000 words in a month at one time in my life seemed impossible. Then it became normal, and eventually it became easy. And this is just the next step past that.
Yeah, you can sort of see the line for that. And you said earlier that you planned it. You did a week of planning that does not count within the 21-day challenge. Like, how thoroughly did you outline, or I should say, did you outline? What was the nature of your planning?
I went in depth in the videos on exactly how I did this, but in a nutshell, I outlined the whole book. So I had a 3-act structure. I wrote a synopsis about what the book was going to be about. I had a little paragraph about each character. Some of them had artwork, some of them didn't for the first draft, but through the process of editing, I added a lot more of that in. Each chapter had usually 2 paragraphs about what the chapter was going to be, just kind of a basic structure of beats. And then for a lot of the more complex chapters, I'd list the cast. So I would say, okay, there's these 5 characters, and I have to sort of track their emotional state. So I had a fairly comprehensive outline before I went into this, and I'm not sure that I could have done it nearly as quickly or easily had I not done that kind of organization first.
Yeah, I never used to be an outliner, and I've been attempting it more recently, and it definitely, at the very least, gives you an idea of you find holes in your plot quicker, and you don't sit down and try to think of what you're supposed to write next because it's written down already. You just move on. I should say that this is intended to be part of a series, right?
Right, so it's going to be at least 3 books. I've also created a prequel, so 4 total. The prequel and book 1 will be out at the same time, and then I'm going to do book 2 and 3 6 weeks apart after book 1.
And when we're talking about the plotting, did you plot out just a single book, or do you sort of have the entire arc in your mind and you're just plotting out individual books in greater detail as you go along?
I had a general arc in mind, but I also set it up so that worst case scenario, if this book totally bombed, I could change the tagline on the cover to just say Destroyer, and it would have a complete enough ending that people wouldn't be upset.
It's a handy thing to do. And I really only have one other question for this section, and it's you mentioned in again earlier that you feel like this can be sustainable. And do you think like this will just be your policy from now on, sort of the 3-week structure for writing a novel?
It'll be a little different because by the end of the 3 weeks, as you'll see in the videos, it's kind of funny to watch going back, where I get more and more exhausted, and I'm wearing more bathrobes, and my hair's all crazy. I think doing it every day is a mistake long term. I was burning out. But what I can do is 5 days a week. So 5 days a week, 5,000 words a day, that's 100,000 words a month. I can do that all day long.
All right. It's interesting how people you hear about writing a book in 3 weeks, and it sounds daunting. But again, my average my minimum is 3,000 words, and even that, like 3,000 words, if you write it every day, is 1,000,000 words a year. It's amazing at how much you can produce with really achievable word counts. Like you don't have to write 10,000 words a day to get a lot of books out in a year.
Yeah, and that's where I think knowing what words to write comes in. If you're writing along kind of a script, if you know the plot of your book and you just keep adding that 3,000 words a day, you're going to finish a 100,000 word book in a month.
Yeah, it's true. I forget. I think it was Neil Gaiman had given the advice to someone who was complaining they didn't have a lot of time to write, and he's like, "I don't care if you write 300 words a day. At the end of a year, you'll have a book, and then that means you've got one more book than you would have had if you gave up." So, yeah, I don't know. There's something to be said about just consistency as opposed to necessarily velocity.
Yeah, consistency is more critical than anything else in this business. If you do one 5 minute writing sprint every single day and that's all that you do, you will have a book at the end of the year. So consistency matters more than I write an hour a day, twice a month.
Yeah, absolutely. And that concludes my questions for this. So now it's off to Jeff.
Alrighty. My question on this, your 21-day novel challenge is, have there been any concerns with starting and completing a novel in 3 weeks? I mean, what were some of the hardest obstacles for you to overcome?
Exhaustion. So there are 3 specific days in the challenge, and I was totally honest, very diary confessional style in these videos, where I didn't want to write. I belong to 2 separate role-playing games, one every other Thursday and one on Saturday nights. They're the Pathfinder game, which is a flavor of Dungeons and Dragons. And I went out to these games, and I stayed out, and I didn't get home until like 10:30 or 11, and I'm rolling in bed by 8:30. So the next morning after those game sessions, I was just exhausted. I didn't want to write at all. I wanted to blow it off and just try and make up the words later, and I made myself sit down and do the words I was supposed to get done that day.
Now, you've already touched on this a little bit, with the quality of work sort of thing. But my question would be, if someone wanted to, or, I'm sorry, what would you say to people who are concerned about quality of work when the subject of how long it took to write comes up?
I would say the same thing I usually tell people when they complain about 5,000 words per hour being sensationalist. If you think that writing fast is going to relate poorly to the quality of your work, ask yourself, when you wrote the best scene that you have ever written, were you kind of hunting and pecking on the keyboard looking for the perfect prose, or did that just flow out of you faster than anything you've ever written?
Yeah, that whenever that works for me, I mean that's when I lose huge chunks of time. So yeah, I know full well, when the bugs got you, you just keep going, and hopefully you aren't interrupted until the moment passes or whatnot. So
Yeah.
I can understand that. Yeah. Um, okay, my next question. If someone wanted to undertake this challenge, someone you haven't ever talked to before has told you that they're a first-time author, or maybe they've released maybe one book at the most, what sort of advice would you give them before they start?
Before you start, make sure you spend as much time as you need to outlining your book. So flesh out every part of that plot that you can, find character artwork, get in the heads of those characters and figure out who they are, and make sure that you have a complete framework and understanding of the world building before you embark on that book.
Good answer. Yeah, I've always outlined. I like having pretty much on knowing what I'm going to cover every single chapter. I leave it up to myself when I get to that chapter, flush it out then and whatever I want to do. So yeah, I've got notebooks all over my desk, so it works for me. But all right, Lindsay, let me hand you over to you for the last couple of questions.
All right, I just want to chime in and agree with Chris that I'll usually write now like 5 to 10,000 words a day when I'm working on a first draft, and I love it. As far as quality, you just sew in the story, you don't lose your way. You finish everything in like a couple weeks, and you still remember what happened in chapter 1. And I don't know, I find it a lot easier, and with the outlining too, you don't have to edit as much afterwards because you already figured out ahead of time how everything is going to go. And I've heard people say like, oh, that takes the fun out of writing because there are no surprises. But you're not doing the dialogue and the fun stuff like that when you're outlining. I think there's still a lot in there to discover along the way. So just my 2 cents there. All right, for people who kind of struggle with motivation, and I think that's a lot. I think a lot of us writers have like other issues. Maybe it's just introvert thing. There's a lot of us with like health issues and things. If you ever go on K-boards, and I remember there was some thread about who's depressed or I don't know something. And so I think it's very common for the creative type to have like issues with motivation and staying with it and stuff. And so do you have any suggestions or tips for how to like really stay excited about the project and want to see it through to the end?
I think it's accepting where you're at in the journey. So we tend to get hung up in big things, and you'll look at this novel you're writing, and it sounded like it was a great idea, and now you're 40% of the way through it, and you don't want to write anymore. If you make yourself finish that, maybe this book is not going to be the most amazing thing you ever write, but along the way you're going to learn a bunch. And so the next book that you write after that's going to be better, and the next one after that's going to be better. So try to adopt the mindset that this is not permanent, the outcome of this particular book you're working on just isn't that important. Go at it with your whole heart and know that whether it's good or it's bad, you are going to grow as a writer. And if you focus on that growth instead of the how is this one book doing when I finish it, then you're going to stay with this long term. And the only thing that prevents people from reaching success as a writer is giving up. As long as you don't, as long as you keep growing, you're going to be able to hit whatever goal you've got.
Yeah, I usually tell people you got to finish the novel, no matter what. Don't abandon it. Don't start a new one because, I don't know, I just think there's a lot of habit forming and actually getting into the habit of just finishing this novel. And then usually when you go back and edit, it's better than you thought it was anyway. So. All right, my last question here before we let you go is just, do you have any thoughts on, we talked about word count and how some genres expect more or less. Do you think I guess I would think it's easier to stick with the shorter stories. Do you have any recommendations for, like, say you are doing epic fantasy and you're just writing 200,000 word novels and that's how it is? Any tips for kind of sticking with that, just the same process, or do you think it requires anything special when you're really writing a long story and how to see it through to the end?
It requires something special in that you have to know that your fans are going to be harder to win than any other genre, but these people will follow you forever. If you can put out a good epic fantasy series or even a great epic fantasy series, when people read these books, they're going to want to get lost in your world. They're going to want to reread this series. So think about how good it is going to feel when you finally finish this book, get it out there, and people love it. Epic fantasy is a lot of fun. People like me, we can burn entire summers with a single series. If you want to be the person providing that series, know that it's going to be kind of a lifelong investment, but it'll be worth it.
Right, and I think one of the perks too, and the same with the space opera stuff and epic fantasy is they're pretty timeless. We were talking about trends before, and what happens if billionaire romance werewolves are no longer in style by the time you finish yours and get yours out there? It seems like you can really enjoy epic fantasy that was published 30 years ago, and 30 years from now, you'll probably still be enjoying the same stuff.
Yeah, giant spaceships, fireballs, and other spells, they're never going to go out of vogue. There's always going to be an audience that loves that stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us tonight and answering our questions. Where can people find you, and which books would you recommend that they pick up?
You can find me at chrisfoxwrites.com. If you're unfamiliar with my nonfiction for writers, I'd recommend starting with 5,000 words per hour. That kind of builds the foundation. After that, lifelong writing habit, and then write to market. All of my fiction stuff is available on my Amazon author page, or you can learn more about it at the website.
Awesome. And I read Write to Market, and will definitely recommend that one. And it's not super long, so it's not like a big commitment if people get into it. And my name is mentioned in there once, so it must be a good book.
Yes, it is.
All right. Thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks everyone for listening. Have a good day.
Hey, thanks for having me
Thanks
on.
for all the info.
So long.